Hi, this is Jeff Conti, your YouTube knife mentor. I'm here today to talk to you about laying out holes for a skeletonized tang. This is a skeletonized tang, and you can see I have my pinholes and I have holes laid out that actually just all I'm doing is removing weight from the knife, so I get a much better balance in the knife handle without that weight. That's also part of the reason that I do tapered tangs, where I have a nice thin, it removes a lot of material, so it helps to balance out the knife. It looks nice when you put your scales on each side, and so I like it. This is one of the things that I do a lot of. So we're going to talk today about how to get these holes laid out so that you don't violate some fairly important guidelines. So first and foremost though, I want you to consider laying out your pinholes first. If you don't do that, you're going to wind up making a mistake, maybe violating your pinhole with your skeleton hole. So on this knife, I'm just going to draw in where I think maybe the leading edge of the handle. This is not going to be a bolstered knife. This is going to be just a regular scale that comes all the way forward, okay? So there's the leading edge, and of course I have the tail end. And you can say, well, there's 3/4 of an inch. So let's mark in 3/4 of an inch right there, okay? So where on this line is the center punch gonna go? Well, I am lazy, okay? And I like to do things simple, or at least as simple as I can. And so I can kind of guess where is center with using a pair of dividers. And then what I'll do is I will get pretty close, and I will, with this side of my divider, I will lay that along the edge of my handle, and I will scratch a line on one side, then I'll flip over, and I'll scratch a line on the other side. Now notice, I don't know if you can see it, but I'm gonna try here. There's a real small gap between these two lines, and that is much easier to find where the center of that is by eye if I use a center punch and a hammer. So I'll just by eyeball. Now my eye is this way, and I can look right down on that and get it right in the middle and whack it. And you can see, I'll use my dividers here. Here's my center hole, and there you can see it's right in the middle. So that's how I find the center point for my pin or my rivet hole. Now you notice I've already done it with this one, and I've drilled a pilot hole already. Okay, so that is my pinhole or my rivet hole. I say pins and rivets because sometimes I use rivets on a knife and sometimes I use pins on a knife. So that's what I'm talking about. All right, once you get your hole laid out for your pin or your rivet, now I'm going to give you some guidelines on how to lay out your skeleton holes, okay? So I'm talking about all these other holes. Number one is you want to have 1/8 of an inch from the perimeter of the hole. So from the outer edge of the hole, 1/8 of an inch to the spine of the knife. So there's 1/8 of an inch there. Same thing on the belly, 1/8 of an inch from the perimeter of the hole to the belly of the knife, 1/8 of an inch. You don't want any less than that. You take the risk or run the risk of getting stress fractures during heat treat, and nothing good comes out of a stress fractured knife during heat treat. So that's number one. Number two, or B, I guess, 1/8 of an inch from the whole perimeter of the pin to the whole perimeter of the skeleton hole. And you would say to yourself, Jeffrey does not have 1/8 of an inch from the perimeter of this hole to the perimeter of this hole. And you're right. I set my dimensions for these two centers based on a different pin. And after I drilled these holes, I thought, oh no, my pin is too small. I got to use a different pin. So I needed to widen this out. Well, that brought my perimeter over what I consider to be too close to these skeleton holes. Now you can see over here, I didn't continue my mistake. I still have 1/8 of an inch from the perimeter of my skeleton hole to the perimeter of my pinhole. So all of those are good. All of these holes are good along the spine and the belly. Last but not least, you want to have 1/8 of an inch from your skeleton hole to your skeleton hole. So it's a matter of figuring out the math, and we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. But there's 1/8 of an inch here, there's 1/8 of an inch here, and there's 1/8 of an inch to my pinholes. So those are your three guidelines, basic guidelines, except for one more. And that is, I don't ever put skeleton holes forward of my pinhole, my leading pinhole. I don't put skeleton holes up here. I think that weakens the knife too much, and I don't like it. So I'm not recommending that you do it either. I think that if you are a custom handmade knife person, you probably want to produce as strong a knife as you can. And that's what I do. So here's my procedure to lay out the holes, okay? First of all, I'm going to assume that my holes are 3/8 of an inch. That's where I start. My holes may have to get smaller. I rarely make them bigger, but sometimes I have to go around something or between something. I could put another pinhole, let's say another skeleton hole right there, but I don't do it. For me, this is just fine. So I start off with 3/8 of an inch, and then I go from there. And then the next one is, this is not the next one, by the way. The next one is actually to do the math. So if I'm going to use a 3/8 of an inch hole, and I want 1/8 of an inch web, in order to put my center line for this hole, I need to know the radius of the skeleton hole. And since this is a 3/8 hole, the radius is 3/16. Add 3/16 to 1/8, and that is 5/16. So what I'm going to do is I am going to measure with my dividers 5/16, okay? And then I'm going to come along, move this out of the way. I'm going to come along and I will scribe a mark. One side of my divider is on the spine, and I will scribe a mark, a line, all the way down both sides and the butt of my handle. So now I have a 5/16 line laid out. So if I use a 3/8 inch hole, which is what I'm planning to use on this, then I won't get any closer than 1/8 of an inch to my spine of the knife or the butt. Or, well, anyway, so we've already talked about where the pinhole goes. Okay, next, so I'm doing the math. I got my 5/16 there, and I scribed that out, which was this one, scribe a line along the spine and the belly. So now what I want to do is I want to determine the distance from my pinhole to my first skeleton hole. And what I have to do is decide what is the diameter of my first pinhole. So let's say my first pinhole is going to be 1/4 of an inch. Okay, so the radius equals 1/8. Okay, and I know I want 1/8 of an inch between the perimeter of this hole and the perimeter of the next hole, so I add the two together, right? Plus 1/8 equals 1/4 of an inch. Now I need to add the radius of my first skeleton hole, which is going to be 3/16 plus 3/16 equals 7/16. All right. So for all four of my first skeleton holes, I'll put it over here so you can see it. All four, 1, 2, 3, 4, all four of my first skeleton holes are 7/16 of an inch from my pinhole. So there's 7/16. Now this has got a hole in it already. I'm a knucklehead. I needed something to so I could hang my knife up, and I put a hole in there, but I'm gonna try to show you anyway. So there is my divot, and now I can scratch an X and another one, and then I can go over to this one and I can scratch an X, and trying to say in the center of that hole, not very easy. Okay, so these first 4 X's are, this dang railroad rail is pretty heavy, are my first skeleton holes. So this is an automatic center punch. So you place that down on your X and push it down and you get a little divot. So you do that for all 4 of these, all right? So we're still laying out. Now we want to know what's the distance from my skeleton hole to my skeleton hole. Well, that's pretty easy. My skeleton holes are 3/8, and the radius equals 3/16. I have 2 of them from center to center, so plus 3/16 equals 3/8. And you say, well, Jeffrey, why don't you just use 3/8 to begin with? Well, for one thing, I'm trying to show you the math. For another thing is, it's possible that you might have a 3/8 inch hole here and a 1/4 inch hole here. So your math would be different to get this 1/8 inch web. Okay, so there's 3/8 plus your 1/8 inch web equals 1/2 inch. Okay, so bring your dividers over. I'm all coffeed up. I got a little jitter on my hands here. Okay, so from my divot that I just made to my next skeleton hole is 1/2 inch, right? And then I don't have a divot here, but I think I can hold it in place. I make another skeleton, I make another X so, and then do it again here. All right, one more time. Okay, so now you can see here, I have, oh, that looks close to an inch. Is that an inch? Nope, it's not. But 1/2 inch and 1/2 inch will not give me what I want here. So I could put another hole here and here in the middle that's smaller than 3/8. At this point, I'm not going to do that. It's rather repetitive and redundant for the purposes of this video. Okay, so I've laid out all of my holes on my knife. I'm going to make a recommendation to you, and that is that you go ahead and you lay these out on a piece of paper. And let me grab my little template. This template is made by Pickett, and it's called the Circle Master, number 1204. It's just a circle template, and you can see, I'll use my pen here, you can see here is the 3/8 hole right here. So since my skeleton holes are going to be 3/8, I can actually, let's see, 3/8 right there, I can actually lay out. Now you see here's my X and my X. I can get this centered between these two, and then I can hold it here. I can move that between these two, and I get my center, and then all I got to do is draw it in. So there is my 3/8 inch hole. I can lay these all out on paper and make sure that I am not getting too close to my pinholes or too close to the spine of my knife or the belly or the butt, or if I'm going to have a bolster. I didn't bring it over here. Let me show you something real quick. So for the sake of this video, you can see this is all one piece, okay? It's all micarta, and this is a 10 millimeter 10 millimeter pin, and the center of that 10 millimeter pin is 3/4 of an inch from the leading edge of the scale to the center of the pin. Same with this back pin, it's 3/4 of an inch from the center of the pin to the butt of the knife handle. if this were a knife with a bolster, right? So let's say there's right here, if this is metal, let's say it's brass, okay, and now this is your wood. You have to go I would go 3/4 of an inch from the end of my brass to my hole, okay? So that's how I lay out my pinholes. Again, I would still use my dividers to find the center area on my knife tang. But it's nice to be able to lay things out on paper. I would also recommend that you go ahead and do this on wood or aluminum practice, so you can get a feel for it before you put it on your first knife handle and kind of get an idea of how it works, drilling holes and all that other stuff. I'm not going to cover the drilling of holes today. I'm not going to talk about center drills and all that other stuff, how to set it up on your machine. I'm just talking about how to lay out your skeleton holes on a full tang knife. I do know that some people will put skeleton holes in their knife handle with larger than 1/8 of an inch web. See this here? They'll just put like a half a dozen holes in and call it good. And that's fine. That's no problem with that. You're adding more strength, albeit, in my mind, more weight to the handle. And depending on the size of your handle, you may want that more weight, right? If the blade is longer than what I have here, I can't really see, but if the blade is longer than what I have here, you may want to have more weight. In fact, you may not skeletonize it. You may not even taper it, but that's up to you. For me, 3/8 of an inch and 1/8 of an inch web. Also, I want to comment that some people will not lay out their skeleton holes. They'll just take a drill and they'll just drill random holes until they get the diameter of the holes and the size are all over the place. I've seen them where they don't care if there's an 1/8 inch web or not. I'm telling you, this is a bad plan right here, having less than 1/8 of an inch and getting a stress fracture there. Okay, so this is Jeff Conti, your YouTube knife mentor. I want you to go out and have fun making a knife.